What is the future of Max Fried with the Atlanta Braves? Is an extension possible? We'll talk about that, answer some of your Max Fried extension questions on this episode of Locked On Braves. We'll also talk about the arbitration figures that will be exchanged on Friday, who could get a deal done, who's likely headed towards a trial. And we'll also talk about some of the news, including robo umpires getting closer and closer to being utilized at the major league level. All that on this episode of Locked On Braves. So let's get into it.
You are Locked On Braves, your daily Atlanta Braves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, and welcome back to Locked On Braves, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, where we cover your favorite Atlanta sports teams each and every day. I am your host, Jake Mastriani. You can follow me on Twitter at shortstopball. Also, make sure you check out my website, shortstopball.com, where you can see all my previous and current work. Also, make sure you follow the podcast on Twitter at LockedOn_Braves. Send in any questions, comments, or feedback that you have for the podcast. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube if you're new. Hit that thumbs up button. If you're watching this video, it helps support the show a ton. And as always, thanks for making Locked On Braves your first listen of each and every day. Got an exciting episode today talking about Max Fried the majority of the time, talking about the likelihood of the Braves extending him, what that extension could look like. I was actually going to do a mailbag episode today, but I wanted to talk about the arbitration figures being exchanged on Friday and Max Fried being a part of that. And a lot of your questions were surrounding Max Fried. And I just got so many questions on my post, and I can't thank you enough for those, that I'm going to do another podcast on Friday. It'll be a late night Friday mailbag podcast. So I will get to your questions, but I just had so many, and I really wanted to talk about Max Fried. We haven't really gone over the extension possibility in a bit here, and I get numerous questions on that. So that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Hey to CJ in the chat section, Daniel Brown as well. Thank you all for joining. Christopher Shaffey in there as well. Thank you as always for your Twitter questions. Thanks for joining the chat. But let's talk about Max Fried. Let's talk about a possible extension for Max Fried. I mentioned arbitration figures due on Friday for Max Fried and 4 other Braves players. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the podcast. I'll go ahead and say I doubt we see an extension with Max Fried in particular, and really any of the Braves arbitration players tomorrow. I think it's more likely we see Max Fried and the Braves go to trial. I mean, the guy is pitching like a Cy Young player. He's pitching like somebody who deserves 25 plus million a year. And yet he's probably going to get around 12 million a year. MLB Trade Rumors, who does a great job of projecting arbitration salaries, projects him to get 12.2 million. So it's probably going to be somewhere in that range. But you want to look at a possible extension for Max Fried and what the Braves could potentially give him and offer him. And I think a good comp is the Carlos Rodon contract that he got this past offseason. 6 years, $162 million. That's for a player who's entering his age 30 season. He's getting paid 6 years through his age 30 through age 35 season. So a little bit older, somebody who's had some injuries history, but also somebody who's been pitching like a Cy Young type pitcher the last couple of years when healthy. And he got 27 million a year, which I think is probably what Max Fried will demand on the free agent market. 27, maybe even more a year for Max Fried. So I try to break it down as far as what Max Fried could get in a hometown discount type extension from the Atlanta Braves. And again, this would be a hometown discount, in my opinion, which is the only type of extension that Alex Anthopoulos is going to offer Max Fried. He's not going to overpay. He's certainly not going to overpay for a starting pitcher who are more volatile and who are more susceptible to injury and missing entire seasons when they are injured. So that's why you don't see Alex go out and take as big a risk on some of these starting pitchers, just because there is a lot more risk involved when signing starting pitchers long-term into their 30s. But I think there's a hometown deal in there that could be offered. I don't know that Max would accept it, but something like 7 years, 160 million. And you look at that and say, that's just under 23 million a year AAV, but you have to keep in mind that's buying out the next 2 years of arbitration years, which would be lower. So something like in 2023 next season, 15 million. That'd be more than he's projected to get in arbitration. So you'd be giving him a little bump for his age 29 season. And then in 2024, which would be his last year in arbitration, give him 20 million, which is probably, a little bit more than what he would get in his last year of arbitration, depending on how he pitches in 2023. That would be his age 30 season. And then from 2025 to 2029, his age 31 to 35 seasons, 25 million a year. And that comes out to 7 years, 160 million, $22.9 million average annual value. Again, that would be a discount. And again, that's the only way I believe a deal gets done with Max Fried is he's willing to take a little bit of a discount. And a good interview, I believe it was Bleacher Report who posted this on Twitter on Thursday with Matt Olson talking about how he could have nickel and dimed the Braves for maybe an extra 10 million, but in the end, he had, everything that he wanted in Atlanta, and he did not, didn't feel that it was good to, go through those negotiations, especially coming to a new team. And I'm not saying every player has to do that or should do that. Max Fried, others have earned the right to go out and nickel and dime for every bit that they think they're worth. But if this is what Max Fried wanted to do, if he wants to be in Atlanta long term, I think that's a deal that makes sense and could be fair. Perhaps you go a little bit higher, 7 years, 175 million even, which is 15 million higher. But I think that makes sense for what Max Fried is worth. And I don't think that would be too much of an overpay. I mean, look, if this guy finishes top 5 in the MVP the next 2 years, and I think he's more than capable of doing that, we're talking about someone who could get close to $30 million a year. And that would not be crazy over, you got to remember though, when he gets to free agency, he's going to be going into his age 31 season. So he's not going to get a 7-year deal at that point. The reason it would be a 7-year deal now is because you're buying out his next 2 years, which would be arbitration years. So you got to keep that in mind. But I think it's a pretty fair deal from the Braves. It's definitely a hometown discount. He would certainly get more in free agency if he pitches the way he has the next 2 years. But I think that's a deal that the Braves could live with, offering Max Fried, paying an average annual value of $22.9 million, never paying more than $25 million a year. Again, I'm not saying that's what Max Fried's worth. I'm saying that's the type of deal that would be considered a hometown discount that the Braves could offer that I would think makes sense. But he certainly could go to free agency and get much more than that. And I've said for a while now, I think he's headed to free agency. And if that's the case, I think he's gone. I think he's going to get close to 30 million a year for 5-6 years from another team out there. So all that being said, I still don't think an extension is likely. I think it was very telling. A lot of you, told me about the Alex Anthopoulos interview on David O'Brien's podcast and how great it was. And it was a great podcast. I went and gave it a listen. It's a lot of things that I've said on here that others have said on there. We've kind of speculated about how Alex Anthopoulos is thinking, but when it's coming from the horse's mouth, not to call a horse by any means, but when it's coming from the boss, then obviously he was being very candid, and you can take that for what it's worth. So I didn't enjoy that interview, but one thing he talked about in there is the fact that he has all these position players locked up long term, but he really worries about the depth of the starting rotation after 2024 and the need to have somebody like Max Fried at the top of the rotation. So I think he's going to make an effort, and I think what I laid out there is a pretty solid effort by the Braves. Again, it's a hometown discount. I realize that. What I'm putting out there, I think Max Fried is worth more than that, but 7 years, 160, I think, could be the type of deal the Braves would offer. And you talk about also on that interview with DOB, he and Eric O'Flaherty mentioned the fact that they feel like Max Fried will age well, and perhaps they will. Look, I heard people saying that Anthony Rendon was going to age well, and he hasn't had a healthy season since joining the Angels. You can't ever really predict that stuff. Eric O'Flaherty, being a pitcher, has more insight as far as how pitchers can health can go and how they will age. And I do think, Fried being athletic, all of that points to the fact that he could have a healthy, career into his mid-30s, but you never really know. That's just the risk with signing starting pitchers long term. But another thing, which I've talked about on here as well, and Alex Anthopoulos mentioned, the difference between signing a Michael Harris, a Spencer Strider, a Ronald Acuna, and Ozzie Albies. Those guys are going to get big deals. And I've said that numerous times this offseason, that it's totally different when you're talking about those guys to when you're talking about Freddie Freeman, Dansby Swanson, and now we're getting to the point where it's going to be Max Fried. This is their last chance to get a big bag. And, Max Fried has earned every opportunity to go do that and to get that money. And I think he will. Again, I've said that all offseason. I think he's going to go to free agency and he's going to go for that one big bag. But that's where a lot of people get mad at some of these Braves extensions they're making. I think they lose sight of the fact that Acuna is going to get another shot at a big contract. Albies will, Strider will, Michael Harris will. It's only really Riley and Olsen who they locked up, for their that was their one big contract in their careers. So it's different for Max Fried. He's looking at his one big shot at free agency, and he's had to wait a long time to get there. I think he's going to take it. I don't think he's going to take a hometown discount, but if he did, 7 years, 160 from the Braves, I think makes a lot of sense. All right, next, got some of your questions specifically about Max Fried that I want to touch on. We'll get to those next. If you're looking for a delicious treat but don't want all the fat and calories, you got to try a Built Bar. We just got through the holidays, and I know my goal is to eat a little healthier this year. If you're like me, where you want to eat healthier but you don't want to compromise taste, then I've got the thing just for you. You got to try Built Bar. With Built, healthy is actually tasty. They're so delicious, you won't think they're good for you. They're perfect for any New Year's resolution out there if you haven't already given up on yours. Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. Right now, I'm really loving the peanut butter brownie, but they have tons of flavors over there that you can check out at built.com. It's like eating a healthy candy bar. It's what people say all the time. Even friend Dale Murphy, who joined the show, that's what he had to say about Built Bars. 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. You can order them online at built.com, but they're also available now at your local Walmart and Sam's Club in the pharmacy section. So whether you go to built.com or go to your local Walmart or Sam's, make sure you go grab a box of Built Bars today. Really excited about our latest sponsor, Big Dog Speakers. Been telling you about them for a couple of weeks now. They have developed these Bluetooth speakers that are just incredible to listen to, just great sound quality. The Scout from Big Dog Speakers, their inaugural Bluetooth speaker, specifically specially designed in Augusta, Georgia, to deliver huge, clear sound, extraordinary battery life, and tons of connectivity options, all at a competitive price. The Big Dog Scout goes big with 105 decibel max volume. It is loud, but again, it is so super clear. 40 watts, waterproof, charges other devices, 15 hours of playback, and you can pair 2 of them together for enhanced audio. The Big Dog Scout is now available online at bigdogspeakers.com at $99, but you can get 20% off with the promo code Locked On and help support the show. So you're looking for a pair of Bluetooth speakers, looking for a gift for somebody, make sure you go to bigdogspeakers.com, use our promo code Locked On. If you want some more information about Big Dog Speakers, visit bigdogspeakers.com. All right, getting to some of your questions that we had. Luke Broom says, with Fried's free agency looming after 24 and the contracts of Morton and Rosario, amongst others, coming off the books, what kind of realistic contract could you see Max commanding, giving all the overpriced contracts offered this offseason? So there's a difference between what I talked about in the first segment and what I think the Braves could offer. It makes sense for the Braves, and I think is enough money to entice Max Fried to sign a deal to stay with the Braves. Very different from what he's going to demand on the free agent market. And that became very clear this offseason where, Luke's right. You saw the amount of money that was thrown at players this past offseason. And Max Fried, again, if he has 2 seasons in these next 2 seasons, like he's pitched, for the last 3-4 years now, I think he's going to demand $30 million a year over 6-7 seasons. Even going into his age 31 season, I think he gets at least a 6-year deal for, I say, at least $28 million a year, if not more. So that's what I think he's likely going to demand in free agency. It might also depend, who else is coming out of free agency that year, but I would say $28 million over 6 years. So you're looking at, close to $170 million over 6 years. I think that could be at a minimum what Max Fried gets in free agency if he stays healthy and productive the next 2 seasons. As a Braves fan, I certainly hope he does, because that means the Braves are having a chance to win division titles, go to the postseason, get back to the World Series, and win another World Series if Max Fried is pitching that way. Bellfire says, in a couple seasons, Ozuna, Rosario, and Morton are all off the books, and Fried is up for a contract. Would you rather use the money from those contracts to give Fried the big contract, go for a superstar outfielder, or split it amongst the pitching staff to get a few good starters? So great question here in terms of how the Braves could split the money. The Braves could have as much as $50 million come off the books next season. They have a $20 million option on Morton. I hope he pitches well enough that the Braves consider picking that up, but I think there's a good chance that they don't, and Morton may want to just ride off into the sunset at that point too, although it's the Braves' call. Rosario has a $9 million option. I shouldn't say it's the Braves' call. If he wants to retire, he can retire, but the Braves hold a club option. Rosario has a $9 million option for next year that even if he plays well this year, I don't see the Braves picking that up. Travis d'Arnaud has an $8 million option. As long as he stays healthy, I think the Braves pick that up as he remains a solid backup, and that's not a ton of money. Yates a $5.75 million option for 2025 or 2024. McHugh a $6 million option, and RC a $2 million option. I could honestly see them picking up all those options except Rosario. Like I said, the Morton one being a pretty big one. If he pitches well, then obviously, that could entice the Braves to bring him back, but that is a pretty hefty number. After the 2024 season is when it's really big, and that's obviously the offseason Max Fried becomes a free agent, but you'd have Max Fried's money coming off the books, which will likely be close to 15, 17 million at that point. You also have Ozuna coming off, who'll be making 18 million in 2024. So have a lot of money coming off in that 2024 season for sure. Now, how would I rather spend that money? And I'd be curious to hear your comments in the comment section on YouTube as well, or on Twitter. I'm actually leaning towards paying Max, and I'm not going to say I've been against paying Max this whole time. It's just the risk in extending starting pitchers into their 30s is just so much higher than it is with position players because of the injury risk. I mean, pitchers are somewhat of a ticking time bomb at some point. That arm is going to go. Justin Verlanders, the Max Scherzers of the world, are just very rare. So it's very risky signing starters into their mid-30s. But you look at the core of this lineup, and it's locked up through the rest of this decade. I mean, catcher, first base, second base, third base, center field, right field, they're all locked up. And a lot could depend on the free agent outfielders in that class. A lot could depend on if anybody steps out in the outfield during that time. It also could depend on if we see some of these players who are locked up regress over that time as well. And obviously what happens at shortstop with Vaughn Grissom. To me, if Vaughn Grissom's not the long-term solution there, I think it's best spent for the Braves to go find an everyday shortstop, just because I think that position is so critical, especially defensively. I just don't know who's going to be out there. So I think, and again, going back to that interview with Alex Anthopoulos, he's worried about the depth of rotation after 2024. I think it'd be better served to spend that money on Max Fried. Now, I wouldn't want to spend free agent money on Max Fried, but if you can get him at that type of deal that I was talking about earlier, then I certainly would try to do that. And I would make a strong effort to extend Max Fried. If not him, then I think you got to find some starting pitching. I think you have to go out and get, a top flight starting pitcher. Maybe, I don't know who it would be at this point, but, a Max Scherzer, Justin Verlander type deal where perhaps you sign a veteran pitcher to a high AAV short-term deal. But I think starting pitching becomes very important after that 2024 season because you have the core position player group locked up for a long time. I think that money is going to be best served going after some starting pitching. And a lot depends on how some of the young guys progress over that time. Is Kyle Wright legit? Does he remain that way? He won't be here too much longer after that. Spencer Strider, does he become that ace and Cy Young candidate that I think he can be? Do we see some of the young prospects come up? AJ Smith-Shawver, is Owen Murphy, J.R. Ritchie, or any of them, are they pushing up to the major league level at that point? So a lot obviously to decide between now and then, but to answer the question, I would be focused on starting pitching with that money that's coming off the books. And Justin Reeves says, aren't the odds of getting an extension this year with Max Fried non-existent? I say that because his AAV would immediately hurt the Braves as they are already over the CBT. Doesn't it make sense to wait until next year where they have the room to duck under the tax? I would say it's not really a point, or it's not really a factor at this point. As you mentioned, they're already over the tax. Unless they're just dead set on getting back under and staying under the tax this year, because it does go by the end of the year number, not the beginning, then yeah, it would probably make more sense to do an extension next off season because that AAV is certainly going to raise that CBT number. But I don't think it's a factor. I think if they could get it done this year, they would, again, at the right price. But next year there is some money coming off the books, but it's not necessarily significant enough that it's going to change their CBT. I would say after that 2024 season, which will be their third year in the CBT, if they are in it the next two, which is where those overage charges go up to 50% and they really start affecting your payroll, that would probably be the time if the Braves wanted to duck back under the CBT that they could do it at that point. But, this is their window to win. And I think the Braves know that. I think Alex Anthopoulos knows that. And they're going to go out there and spend to put the best field on the team. They've shown that to me. I know there's a lot of fans that don't believe that, but I truly do. So I don't think it's a factor as far as when they extend Fried. I don't think the CBT has much to do with that. But appreciate the questions on Max Fried. Again, I got a ton more questions for the mailbag that we'll get to on Friday's podcast. But next, I do want to transition, talk about the arbitration players on Friday who will be exchanging figures, who gets done, who's going to trial. And they got a lot of news as well that I want to touch on and then get to some of your questions in the chat. So there are some other arbitration players beside Max Fried that the Braves still have to agree to a deal with. A.J. Minter, another big one. He's projected to make $5 million. Would not be surprised if they go to trial either. A.J. Minter was one of the best relievers in all of baseball last year. He's probably hoping to get a big bonus here. And I would imagine the Braves are going to try to play that card that, hey, he's not a closer and keep that money down. So wouldn't be surprised if they go to trial. Joe Jimenez, who the Braves traded for this past offseason, projected to get $2.6 million. Dennis Santana, $1.1, and Lucas Litke, $1.7. I think all three of those get agreed upon deals before Friday's deadline. I don't think we see any extensions here. Sometimes you'll see extensions at these deadlines. I don't think they will. Just a reminder, the Braves are typically a file and trial team. So that means they'll exchange numbers on Friday if they can't come to an agreement, and then they'll let it sit until their arbitration date and let the arbiters figure it out which number they're going to go with. But that'll all be happening on Friday. I'll mention that on the Friday mailbag as well if we get some of those numbers in. Bit of news late on Thursday. Buster Olney reporting that all AAA parks will use the electronic strike zone in 2023. Half of them will use it for every call, while the other half will use it as a challenge system, which I actually like. And they kind of introduced this last year where each team, I believe, gets maybe 3 challenges throughout the game. I think that's coming to MLB soon. Most likely, I think that's the most likely form of electronic strike zone that we're going to see is a challenge system. And I think that makes a lot of sense. My question, though, is how does that affect catchers like Sean Murphy, who make a lot of their money off being able to frame pitches? Will it hurt their value? I think it certainly will if you go to a full electronic strike zone, but a challenge system, I think, may even increase their value because the way they catch it And the way they frame it may, convince the other team not to challenge a call by the way that the catcher frames the pitch up. So I think catchers like that still become increasingly value even with the challenge electronic strike zone system. Miguel Rojas traded to the Dodgers for Jacob Amaya. I know Rojas was mentioned as a potential candidate for the Braves that they could trade for. I never really saw that fit. He's great defensively, doesn't strike out or swing and miss, but he also doesn't walk. He doesn't hit for power, and he isn't fast. I would have liked him as a stopgap or a defensive replacement, but not my everyday shortstop. We'll see where he fits in with the Dodgers. The player they gave up for him is pretty much the same thing as Miguel Rojas. He's a defensive first shortstop, hasn't shown much with the bat, but obviously he's a lot younger and has some upside. Padres signed Nelson Cruz to a $1 million deal. And then this is exciting. Braves pitchers and catchers set to report on February 15th. So we are just a little bit over a month away from pitchers and catchers reporting, and that is certainly very, very exciting. And then MLB sets a new revenue record in 2022, exceeding $10.8 billion. So don't let anyone out there tell you that baseball is dead, because it certainly is not. And don't let any owners tell you that they can't afford these players, because they certainly can. All right, I'm going to try to go through the chat section real quick. Kami says, forget Fried, extend Soroka and Ian Anderson while their value is low. AA and the staff believe in Soroka's upside. You can hear that in that conversation with Alex Anthopoulos as well. He's very, very excited about Mike Soroka, and I could certainly see the Braves getting out in front of that. If anybody was going to give a hometown discount to the Braves, I would hope it would be Mike Soroka after they've stuck with him through all this. I mean, the guy hasn't pitched in nearly 3 years, and the Braves have been paying him close to $3 million a year for that. William Fulgham says, do you feel any better about Fried extension after a interview with David? Kind of touched on that. I do feel it has given me a little bit of hope, whereas before I thought there was absolutely no chance. I think Alex is at least going to make an attempt, and I think he could make something close to what I suggested, 7 years, 160. I still don't think it gets done, but my optimism for Alex Anthopoulos and the Braves pushing hard for an extension has gone up. I still don't think it's going to happen. Christopher Shaffey, hey, Jake, do you think Chipper is the best defensive third baseman the Braves have had? That's a good question. I mean, I can't think of anybody offhand that was better defensively. I always thought Chipper was underrated defensively at third base, and I always get mad about that. One year he should have won the Gold Glove, and they gave it to that player in New York, David Wright. But I do think he was always underrated defensively, but I can't recall anybody better. I'm sure there probably has been. Hollywood says, as much as I really miss Freeman, notwithstanding the presence he brought, he's replaceable. Pitchers are not. I hope AA offers a competitive 6-year, 162 offer to Max Fried. Do you think that's possible offer? I do. And again, I gave you my number that I think is a hometown discount, but makes sense at 7 years, 160, 162 would certainly make sense as well. But I think he tries to get a deal through at least his age 35 season. CJ says Max needs to be a Brave forever. Sutton says extend Mentor too. That wouldn't be all that shocking if the Braves maybe tried to work out an extension with Mentor. I still don't think it happens. Double A says, yay, a birthday podcast for me tomorrow. Yeah, I'll be doing an extra mailbag Friday because all the great questions you sent in. We'll be doing a late night podcast on Friday after the fam goes to sleep. Pierce Gilbert, in my opinion, Fried is in contention for the best lefty in the league. Only Rondon is comparable, and I agree. And I think that's why the deal Rondon got is a comparable one when looking at Max Fried. And Rondon got $27 million a year, and I think Fried easily gets that on the open market. Double A, especially since we have a stacked rotation, I don't want to lose him, but it won't be the end of the world. And a lot depends. Again, that just depends on how the rest of these pitchers, step up. Are Strider and Wright, are they enough of a 1-2 punch to win a World Series? Does Ian Anderson step up? He's still under control for a while. What happens with Mike Soroka? What happens with some of these young guys? Dylan Dodd, do one of those guys step up in the rotation? Still a lot to figure out. Olsen, AJ said Olsen interview was with Starting Nine this morning. Thank you for clarifying that. I only saw a snippet of it on Twitter. Champ says 175 would work. I bet for both sides on a 7-year deal. I think that I think that would certainly work for both sides as well. I think that would be a very fine offer. Probably more than the Braves want to pay. Again, the offer I gave you is a hometown discount. That's probably more to what his market value is, maybe even a little bit more. Matthew Biddingham says, I think Soroka becomes a free agent the same time as Fried. So even if Soroka bounces back, great. The Braves could lose both of them at the same time. And that's a very good point as well. It's a big year for Soroka. I think if he shows he can be healthy and shows that he can be a productive pitcher, then he becomes an extension candidate as well. And perhaps you get him a little bit cheaper than Max Fried. Doug Count says, I hope I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like Max wants to test free agency and possibly go home to the West Coast. I kind of get that feeling as well. And that's where I've been for a while with Max Fried. Sutton Tillery says, opinion on Jose Iglesias and Elvis Andrus. I would like Jose Iglesias. Strong shortstop. Again, kind of the same thing I talked about with Miguel Rojas. Would like him as a stopgap defensive replacement bench type player. Wouldn't want him as my everyday shortstop, but is somebody you could put ninth in the lineup that you know is going to put the ball in play. Matthew Biddingham says, I wish the Braves went to a 6-man rotation. Let Soroka ease back in as number 6. I like that idea as well, but to do that, you got to have 6 guys who are going to give you a chance to win every time out there. And if Soroka and Anderson look like themselves in spring training, perhaps you can do that, and maybe they will. But I am curious how, if Soroka is healthy and he's back and looks good, how they limit his innings, because they certainly will need to. Alan says, Braves Nation hanging their hopes on the tall, lanky gunslinger from out west, the man they call Max. Certainly do love him. Hollywood says pitching is key. Give Fried an offer that will be competitive. I certainly think they will try to. Daniel Brown, who goes to the top of the rotation if Fried leaves? Strider or Kyle Wright? I believe it's Strider. I think he becomes the ace. William Martin, why do you think Wright gets underrated by everyone? It's because it's the same thing with Max Fried. Max Fried is underrating. Buster Olney wrote an article the other day projecting all-stars for 2023 and did not even mention Max Fried's name, which is just crazy. He just finished second in the NL Cy Young, but it's because Fried, right, they're not dominating pitchers. They don't strike out a lot of batters. They're more ground ball prone, so they get overlooked a bit. All right, losing my voice some, so I'm going to wrap things up here. Make sure that you subscribe, listen to Locked On Braves, and we will talk to you next time.